The government is proposing to fundamentally change the way in which EPCs are assessed and also to increase the standards that landlords have to comply with, increasing it to EPC C. I put out a video a week ago that goes through all of these changes. And since then, I've had so many questions from people in the comments underneath the YouTube video, people emailing me in my Facebook group, and in the comments underneath my blog post. And so what I've decided to do is to pull all of these many questions together into 15 themes and go through them all one by one. Everything from what the exemptions are going to be, what grants might be available, whether HMOs are going to be effective, short-term lets, lots and lots of things. And stick around to the end because I'm going to be sharing with you what I'm going to be doing with my own properties that are currently all EPC C, some only just, and what I'm going to be doing to make sure that I qualify for the transition period for as long as possible. Who am I? I'm Suzanne Smith, lawyer turned landlord, and I run the Independent Landlord website and this YouTube channel to bring you reliable information without all the clickbait nonsense that you see everywhere. Right, let's get started. But before I do, I just want to explain that the answers that I'm giving are based on the proposals in the government's February consultation document. It's called Improving the Energy Performance of Privately Rented Homes in England and Wales. So I'm calling this the February consultation. And then there's another one, the more general consultation on EPCs that came out in December 2024. And that's called Reforms to the Energy Performance of Buildings regime. And I'm going to call that the December consultation because that's relevant as well. Now, as with any consultations, the government may alter its plans after these consultations. The dates may change and some of the detail may be tweaked. But I still think it's important that we understand what the government is proposing, and not least because we can give our thoughts on these before the two consultations end. And if you want to find links for this, you can have a look in my blog post. Okay, the first question is, will it be easier or harder to get an EPC C in the new system? That's a really good question. And this is what the government said, and I quote, they wish to prioritize meeting a standard set against the fabric performance metric, which is likely to require similar improvement measures as meeting an EPC C on current EPC Cs, and then to meet a standard set against either the heating system metric or the smart readiness metric. That's clear, isn't it? What does that mean? Well, at the moment, the system is based on a cost-based energy efficiency rating, and you might see that referred to as EER. And as gas is cheaper than electricity, properties with gas boilers at the moment do better in EPCs than properties with electric heating and electric hot water, even if those properties don't have good insulation. And this is because gas boilers are cheaper to run. But in the future, the fabric performance of the building will be much more important. So this all means that a property with excellent insulation, double glazing, and an electric heating system is likely to do a lot better under the new system. And I know that this is the case for flats. A lot of flats have electric heating, and a poorly insulated home will go down. But the good news is it's comparatively cheap to put more insulation in the loft if you have one. Windows are a lot more expensive, and I spread mine over a few years for that. The next question. Can you go through the timeline again, as I'm confused? Sure, this is what the government's proposing. Late 2026, the new way of measuring EPCs will come into force. And after this date, all new EPCs will be on the new system. That means if you want a new certificate under the old system, say you already have a C and you want to benefit from the transition arrangements, you'll need to get a new EPC done before the new system comes into force. Now, we don't know exactly when that will be. The consultation document says it's late 2026, but I'll certainly be monitoring it. So make sure you subscribe to my newsletter. That's the independentlandlord.com/subscribe. I send it out every Friday and it's completely free. And also subscribe to this channel because I'll be doing lots of content on this. Okay, the next date. And this is a really big date. It's 2028. And as I said, we don't know exactly when, but the reason why this is an important date is after this date, all new tenancies will need to have an EPC C, whether that's an EPC under the current system that we have now or an EPC C under the new system. And then the final date is 2030. This is the backstop date for landlords with long-term tenants who might have been there from before the 2028 date. After this date, all rental properties will need to have an EPC C unless they have an exemption. And so that's either one from the old system or one from the new system. Next question. Will the proposals affect HMOs? Well, the government is proposing that there should be a valid EPC for an entire house when a single room is let out. Whereas at the moment, this isn't required when rooms in an HMO are let out on a room-only basis, although they are required if you let out an HMO as a joint tenancy, like for students. Given that HMOs tend to have a higher turnover of tenants than single lets, this means that HMOs will need to be ready for 2028. And the government is saying that they're doing this to make sure that the HMO, the whole building, meets the same standards as other rental properties. And the December consultation proposes a 24-month transitional period for any HMO landlord newly brought into scope of the regulations of a valid EPC. Now, I'm not sure when that 24 months is going to start, whether that's 24 months from 2028 or from 2026. So, watch this space. And as I said, all of these rules are subject to consultation and the dates may slip. The next question. Will I need to get a new EPC each time I sign a new tenancy agreement? Well, currently an EPC is valid for 10 years. And so you don't need to renew it each time you have a new tenant. However, the December consultation proposed that rental properties will need a valid EPC at all times, whereas at the moment, if you have a long-term tenant and it expires, you don't need to bother getting another one until you next market the property for letting. Now, that is still a proposal in the consultation document. We don't know if that's going to happen. So if landlords do need to have one at all times, if that rule's brought into effect from the second half of 2026, landlords will begin replacing their properties' existing EPCs with a new one once they expire, even if they have a continuing tenancy. And it's possible that a property with an EPC C now might drop to an EPC D in the future when the new metrics come into force. And that leads on to the next question. I have EPC Cs on my properties now. Should I renew them before the rules change in 2026? So that's the new metrics. Well, properties with EPC Cs under the old system will be deemed to comply with the new rules until their EPC certificate expires. So in this situation, I would contact the assessor who did the previous EPC C. Tell them what improvements that you've made and what they advise. So if you've got a marginal EPC C, say a 69 or a 70, I have one of those, then you might look at doing something to boost it a little, like a bit more insulation in the loft, making sure all the lights are low energy, but speak to your EPC assessor. Next question. How does the £15,000 cost cap actually work? Do I have to spend the full $15,000? The consultation says that landlords must try the recommended improvements to achieve a new C, and the clock is due to start ticking on that in the second half of 2026. So if you're spending money now, it will be outside the cost cap. And if you have done all of what's recommended, and then the next thing that you need to do, say solar panels, will take you above 15,000, then you don't need to actually spend that. But it's complicated. Next question. My property is only worth £80,000 and I cash flow £100 a month. I can't afford these upgrades. What should I do? A very good question. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in this situation. Well, first of all, check to see whether or not you're eligible for the new Warm Homes Local Grant, which is due to be launched in April 2025 by local authorities. And this is actually quite generous. Landlords will qualify for receiving 100% of funding for the first eligible property up to £15,000. And after that, they can get a 50% cost contribution for upgrading any additional properties, so long as the property is a D or below. And so the important word here is eligible properties. And there are 3 pathways to eligibility. Pathway 1 is eligible postcodes, and these are based on the indices of multiple deprivation income deciles. And I have a link in this blog post so you can have a check to see if any of your properties are in these postcodes. And the blog post is theindependentlandlord.com/EPC-landlords. Pathway 2. The household receives specific means-tested benefits. And here's the list. And you'll see it includes universal credit and income-based job seekers allowance. And I think that this will be very useful for lots of landlords who welcome people with universal credit into their properties as tenants. Pathway 3. The household income is below 36,000, and the income of every adult member of the household counts, apart from those in full-time education. So if you have somebody who has a son or a daughter who's living at home and at university on a full-time course and they have a part-time job, you don't need to count that. The next question. I'm thinking of switching to serviced accommodation, short-term let. Will that be okay? Well, at the moment, short-term lets don't require a minimum EPC. However, the government is consulting on making it compulsory to have a valid EPC C, irrespective of whether the occupier is responsible for meeting the energy costs. And so the government explains that they're doing this, and I quote, to discourage landlords from changing their properties from privately rented properties to short-term lets to avoid improved MEES and reducing the availability of privately rented homes. This would add protection for tenants who are most at risk of being evicted, such as those in rural areas and popular holiday destinations. So in other words, it doesn't make any difference whether the landlord or the owner of the property pays the bills, which is what happens when you let something on Airbnb. They're just trying to make it less attractive for landlords to switch to serviced accommodation if they don't think that their property will meet an EPC C standard. Next question. Isn't the government proposing to make EPCs expire after 5 years? Well, in the December consultation, one of the questions was whether the 10-year validity period should be reduced to, say, 5 years, and they give other options as well. And they're proposing, as I said, to require landlords to renew them when they expire, even if the tenant doesn't change. So we don't know if it's going to reduce to 5 years. Well, the government has said that they will allow all existing EPCs to remain valid until the end of their existing validity period and apply any new validity period to new EPCs. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what that means is that the government are proposing that if you have an EPC at the moment that has a 10-year validity period before it expires, then that you will keep that. It'll only be the new EPCs that come into force if this rule is adopted that will have the shorter period. So it's another reason to keep your EPCs up to date if you have an EPC C. Next question. What if the freeholder or the conservation rules won't allow me to insulate or replace windows, or do any other work for that matter? The February consultation says that if you need third-party consent from, say, a freeholder, a planning authority, or the listed building authority, and that person, that company refuses to let you do what's needed to improve the efficiency of your building, then, or they impose unreasonable conditions, then you can apply for what's called a third-party consent exemption for 5 years. You'll also need to provide evidence of refusal and use what they call best efforts, which is actually quite a high hurdle to obtain consent. The next question is really good. What if my tenant refuses to let me do the work? Well, you can apply for an exemption provided that the tenant remains in the property, and when they move out, then you'd then have to do the work and upgrade the property. But this needs to be genuine, and you'll need to provide evidence. So you'll need to do the work anyway when they move out. There's another question. What if a landlord tries to game the system by telling tenants to deny consent? Well, this would be fraud, a serious offence, if you're making the tenant refuse consent, whereas they would actually want to give consent. And the tenants or anyone else could report you. We should comply with the law, the spirit and intent of the law, and not try and do underhand illegal things like this. Next question. If I buy a property with tenants already in place and it's an EPC D, do I get a grace period? Well, yes, the February consultation says you'd have 6 months from the date that the landlord, that you become the landlord, to make improvements or to register for an exemption. So if you take over a property that's EPC D or E or below, then you won't be penalised immediately, but you must act fast and make sure that you factor in the timelines before you buy. The next question is very popular. My house has solid external walls. Am I supposed to insulate the walls? I know this has been in the media recently, and I'm in this situation. All of my properties have solid walls. I don't want to insulate them, as it would reduce the room size. I mean, I'd have to go back to brick, and then there's problems with condensation. So the government has said that they recognise, and this I'm going to quote, that some fabric measures, such as solid wall insulation, may not be appropriate for particular properties. There are a range of exemptions available under the existing regulations which landlords may register for in circumstances where fabric measures cannot be installed. So I guess it means we don't have to, if we have good reasons not to have to go back to brick and put in wall insulation if we have solid walls. Next question. Will I need to achieve EPC C if my house is listed or in a conservation area? Currently listed buildings and certain buildings in conservation areas don't need an EPC if carrying out the recommended improvements would unacceptably alter their character or appearance. Now, the December consultation proposes removing that blanket exemption. This means that you would need to carry out an EPC for a listed building or a heritage property. The government wants these heritage buildings to have an EPC so that the owners are informed about the potential for energy upgrades, and then they can do the ones that won't jeopardize the heritage features. However, it doesn't mean that you'll have to achieve an EPC C in every scenario. It depends on what the measures will be. And in the December consultation, they said, we will consider making changes to the EPC calculation methodologies to enable tailoring of recommendations for traditional buildings and those in conservation areas and other heritage buildings. Now, I promised at the beginning that I would say what I'm going to be doing with my properties. Now, they all have EPC Cs at the moment, and they expire at different periods, and some of them have got like 6 years to go from now. So I'm going to contact the EPC assessors who did the certificates last time and chat to them about what I've done since they last did it, and ask whether or not they think, as the rules stand now, that I will still get an EPC C if they rerun it all. Now, for the one I did in November, I'm not worried about that because the rules haven't changed. But some of the older ones, I just don't know whether or not the rules have already changed to change the calculation. And depending what they say, I will then get new certificates, probably sometime in the beginning of 2026, so that I have that long validity period of 10 years from that date to benefit from the transition arrangements for as long as possible. And then I'm going to not worry about it, because a lot can happen in 10 years. And as long as I've got my properties to EPC C before the rules change, that's all I'm worrying about now. And I think, we've got to take a realistic approach to this. Things change, technologies change, and 10 years is a long time away. And I think as long as I try and have as much of that period as possible, that's all I can do now. And then I'm just going to try not to worry about it. Now, I appreciate that not everybody is in the position that they have EPCCs. I mean, I haven't been investing over the last few years to get them to that position, but you just need to decide what you want to do for your properties, whether it's worthwhile for you to do the upgrades. You might be lucky enough to apply for an exemption, which would be fantastic, or you might not have much to do. Or you might be in a situation where you'll actually benefit because you've got electric heating, for instance. And I'm going to be doing a lot more content on EPCs. And so I've set up this playlist here. So check it out once you finish this video. And as I said before, you can always keep up to date by subscribing to my free newsletter, theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. See you soon.